Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. Today, I would like to address a question that arose out of my previous presentation, titled Reasons Not to Pursue a PhD. This question arose because my presentation was largely targeted at the kind of person who performed extremely well academically, up to the point where he or she would make a decision about whether or not to go to graduate school. And this is the kind of person that really gets pigeonholed into a PhD program. All of the expectations of professors, parents, the surrounding culture channel very high-performing students in that direction. The questioner asked me, well, what about students who had mediocre grades in college and are now faced with a choice about what to do once they graduate? How do they launch their careers? How do they make sure that they have adequate standards of living? How do they make sure that they perhaps find some personal fulfillment in what they do? And these are all very valid questions. In part, I'm extrapolating from the questioner's intentions, but I'm sure a lot of people today are thinking very seriously about this, irrespective of what grades they received in high school or in college. And I wanted to say, before I begin, that everything I present here is not a commentary on a person's character. That is, I don't think that having gotten less than perfect grades, or even having gotten mediocre grades, is necessarily a mark against an individual. Some individuals thrive well in academic environments. Other individuals have a different focus to their personalities, and it may be that what leads them to get mediocre grades isn't so much their own deficiency as the deficiency of the academic environment in which they find themselves. And moreover, there isn't really that much of a gulf between people who get excellent grades and people who get mediocre grades. Very often it's a question of focus. It's a question of priorities. It's a question of what individuals wish to spend their time on. Now, I don't have much respect for people who spend much of their lives in a self-destructive or dissipative fashion. However, there are cases where individuals have enjoyments, hobbies, areas of interest that simply don't align with an academic structure and the expectations of the academic structure in which they find themselves. I have no problem with that, and I don't mean to diminish the preferences, values, and priorities of these kinds of individuals. Indeed, it's my intent here to assist them. So, I think some principles are in order, and I'll try to keep them suitably general because I think a lot of people of varying interests could benefit from this advice. Now, a student who received mediocre grades typically will not be channeled into a PhD program, and so really the question is, what sort of paid employment will he or she get after graduating from college? And it may even be that this individual chooses not to pursue a college degree. As I've previously indicated, I make no negative value judgments about that. I do not think college is for everyone. So it may be that I'm speaking to some people who find themselves in that position. Absolutely fine. My first piece of general advice is that departure from orthodox paths is necessary, but it's not sufficient for success. And what I mean by that is this. First, the necessary component. If you are going to try to be just like everyone else in every conceivable way, and by that I mean trying to conform as much as possible, your results in life are always going to be mediocre, and you're going to struggle. Because right now the majority of people are struggling in this very uncertain economic environment where opportunities are limited, and where people's expectations of what economic opportunity in the United States is are being severely challenged. A lot of the predominant expectations of the housing bubble years and the years that preceded them have pretty much been exploded by the events of the past 3 years. So, following orthodox assumptions, conventional assumptions, conformist assumptions, is only going to get you into a rut, into a struggle, and perhaps even a struggle for your very survival. A lot of people in this economy who have lost their jobs have found that they have mortgages they cannot sustain. And sometimes it's none of their fault. Other times, it is partially their fault because they bought into the myth of one's house as an ATM, where they could just take out home equity loans and live off of those, expecting their homes to appreciate in value indefinitely. Well, that didn't happen. That's one example of a conventional assumption that perhaps should not be pursued. Now, there are many ways to depart from orthodoxy, and one should seriously consider them. For instance, does one really have to work in a big city? A lot of people are attracted to big cities not because there actually are significantly greater opportunities there, but because it's seen as more prestigious. A big city is seen as the place to be. And it is the case that for some jobs, the economies of scale and the network effects that exist in a big city may be more conducive to employment, but one has to weigh that against the costs of living in that area, and whether, for instance, the marginal benefit of perhaps slightly higher pay of living in a big city outweighs the greatly increased cost of living, which is most especially reflected in real estate prices, though it's also somewhat reflected in the prices of basic goods like the cost of food, the cost of gas, the cost even of furniture and clothing. Another question is, what is a possible way to depart from orthodoxy in terms of training and education? Once again, a lot of people think that the best way, the most prestigious way, the way most likely to lead to success is to get some kind of either graduate school degree, a master's degree, or a PhD, or to get one of the more career-oriented degrees that still require extensive schooling. For instance, a medical degree, a law degree, a Master of Business Administration, which I think is an overhyped degree. But that kind of training is very expensive. It often requires a greater monetary investment than college did, and it lands many people who pursue it in debt. And perhaps for some people there is a monetary return on that time and money spent. But is the marginal benefit greater than the marginal cost? And not only has it been historically, but is it going to be in this very uncertain economy where all of these conventional assumptions are being challenged and being violated? Another question to seriously ask oneself is, are there orthodox expectations regarding lifestyle and standard of living that might not be valid or that might not be particularly beneficial to a given individual? Some people spend a lot of money on brand name items, which are much more expensive than their generic equivalents, and in terms of sheer functionality, don't offer a significant quality improvement. And I'm not talking about foregoing actual material comforts. It's easy to receive a substantial amount of comfort in today's technological society without having certain names on the clothes you wear, without having certain labels on the apparel you use, without necessarily buying what is raved about the most. That is one possible unorthodox assumption. Once again, if it is indeed more expensive to live in a big city and the benefits don't justify the costs, but if one considers it somehow more glamorous to do so, perhaps one should re-examine that assumption. And once again, I'm not saying there's a one-size-fits-all solution here, but looking outside of what the mainstream considers to be the most desirable and prestigious solution is one possible way of gaining success and at least increasing the probability of success. Another possible approach in that area is to look outside of a particular geographical region where one had always expected that one would live or one would work, being ready to perhaps relocate and seek opportunities elsewhere. Perhaps one will find a nicer standard of living, a more pleasant area, lower real estate prices, and perhaps even activities that one enjoys more in the vicinity. Now, that being said, I get now to the part where being unorthodox is not sufficient. That is to say, there are plenty of conceivable ways of being unorthodox that lead to failure. So one really has to think about the material implications of a particular choice. I'm not saying here, do whatever you fancy just because you might enjoy it more for one reason or another. One also has to consider practicality. If a particular job isn't available in an area where you really like to live, then to support yourself, you're either going to need to think about a different area or you're going to need to think about a different kind of job. And one other possible way of being unorthodox, in a good way, is not to consider yourself strictly confined to one career path or one job description. Think about it more in terms of what you as a human being are capable of, what you would find either enjoyable or reasonably comfortable to work in, and pursue that. Diversify not just your willingness to accommodate circumstances, but also your willingness to do particular tasks, once again within limits. Don't contort yourself. Don't try to do something just to satisfy some kind of popular or mainstream conception of what one is expected to do or what is prestigious to do, but nonetheless have some flexibility in the kinds of skills you're willing to acquire and the kinds of work you're willing to perform. Now, that's all very good, but one excellent way to really sabotage your future is to incur a lot of debt for the purpose of jump-starting a career. And this is my next main point. Strive to avoid incurring additional debt for the purposes of building a career or a business. And this applies not just to finding a job, living in a particular area, buying a home, but also if you want to go strike out on your own, be an entrepreneur, see how you do in that. Or if you want to pursue some kind of education, get a credential, get a degree. If you have to incur massive debt that you're going to spend many years paying off in the future, that's not wise. And it's not wise no matter what field you're choosing. And the reason is this. One can no longer rely on the expectation of income many years into the future or indefinitely. The economic situation doesn't permit that kind of long-range planning anymore. And so if you spend $100,000 of money you don't have paying for a degree that might get you something, but then again might not, then you are really mortgaging away your future. One, you're committing yourself to an arduous path of drudgery, of greatly reduced standards of living in the meantime. And two, it may well be that you're thrown out on the street because you can't afford to pay that educational debt. You may be aware that even if you declare bankruptcy, unlike, say, credit card debt or even mortgage debt, which might be forgiven or diminished as part of the bankruptcy settlement, student loans never go away. They cannot be extinguished in a bankruptcy. You are going to be on the hook for that debt the rest of your life, and any kind of advantageous deferment you might get while you're still pursuing that degree or credential is going to come back and bite you, because after that the interest does accumulate, and there are reported cases of people whose student debt doubled or tripled after they graduated because they were unable to make enough of an income even to make the regular payments on that debt. So this advice is general, but it's also categorical. And in my opinion, it's beneficial for everybody. Do not go into debt to get any kind of degree or credential. That being said, some of you might ask, well, in my particular case, that rules out being a lawyer, that rules out being a doctor, that might even rule out being an MBA. So what do I do? Well, first of all, perhaps being a lawyer, doctor, or MBA in this economy isn't particularly the wisest choice. There's a lot of unemployment among young law school graduates right now. A lot of people who went to law school and even had associateships lined up for them afterward found those job offers rescinded when the recent economic crisis hit. With medicine, of course, I would prefer there to be a lot of qualified, intelligent doctors, but the fact is there's a lot of uncertainty in the profession, especially since the passage of the recent health insurance bill, the misnamed Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act. And with MBAs, there are numerous studies suggesting that the degree doesn't really add value to an individual's skills or an individual's earnings. It's quite artificial, and it doesn't seem to correlate with how well an individual manages a business or an individual's entrepreneurial ability. So try to find different credentials. And there are many fields where the credentials are much less expensive. One example that I know from personal experience is insurance. There are many kinds of credentials that can be obtained through testing and self-study. You can obtain credentials for an actuary, for an underwriter, for an insurance examiner, for a claims adjuster, for an insurance agent. You can obtain specialty designations in subfields of insurance, for instance, reinsurance, surplus lines insurance. I could go on. Of course, that doesn't have to be your field of choice. There are many fields where the certifications and accreditations are largely pursued in a self-study fashion. And they're not all that expensive. A particular exam might cost $500 on the high end, and a particular designation might consist of 1 to 5 exams. Some require 8 or 10. That's much less than you'll pay for a single year of tuition virtually anywhere. And in many of these fields, you can do some kind of paid work that will more than pay for those credentials while you're pursuing them. And I don't claim to know everything about credentialing in every field. As a matter of fact, what I would recommend to anybody who's thinking about starting out in some kind of field is to do some research. What paths are available for you to boost your knowledge and also your employability? A credential is a great way to do that. Now, That being said, of course, don't overreach your financial capacity. Don't spend your last dollar trying to get a certificate of any kind, because employment prospects are not certain. Be willing to diversify the kinds of credentials you get, either within a particular broad field, get designations that focus on many areas of that field so that you could be employable in multiple capacities. And if someone does hire you, you can market yourself as someone who can do many different tasks. A person who can be relied upon in an exceptional situation to take on a role that is perhaps unconventional. Another general piece of advice is always be open to learning more. Always be open to developing your skills, and be very clear about this. It's no longer the case that you can say for any kind of endeavor, be it a self-employed endeavor or an endeavor where you're employed by somebody else, that a particular task is just outside your job description, outside the realm of skill that you can reasonably be expected to have. The fact is that strict segmentation into job descriptions is not particularly realistic. Reality doesn't segment itself in that way. And if my study of philosophy has taught me anything, it's that every aspect of reality is related to every other aspect. And what that means is that you have to be willing to do a task that's related to what you're doing, and you have to be willing to branch out into tasks that perhaps are even only tangential. But what you can do in that situation is a lot of your own research. The internet is a valuable tool. It's a valuable tool at work as well as on your own time. If you don't know something, don't say it's outside your job description, look it up. If you don't know how to do something, try to find a resource, preferably a free resource, that will teach you. And moreover, in that pursuit of credentialing of any kind, if that's what you choose to do, there are plenty of free resources that can answer a lot of your questions and move you farther along in terms of knowledge. And if you can't find a free resource, maybe you might even create your own, some kind of free study guide based on the material that you've been reviewing in order to get that credential. Now, speaking of that, I've mentioned a lot about continuing to educate oneself in a genuine way, continuing to acquire new skills and new competencies. And I would suggest to you that your ability to educate yourself doesn't have anything to do with the kinds of grades that you might have gotten in high school or college. That is to say, it's a question of what you do from this point forward, not a question of what you have done up to now. If you get competent at a particular field of endeavor, and preferably at multiple fields of endeavor, preferably in such a way that you're also able to generalize the skills and experience you've learned so that you would be able to add value in even tangentially related fields, then it doesn't matter what grades you got in high school or college. And especially after a few years, very few employers, business partners, other individuals from whom you might expect some kind of financial benefit will look at what your grades were, what diplomas you got in what subjects from which college. At the very best, for someone who did get good grades in college, in a few years, all you'll really have would be some bragging rights, saying, well, I got this score on the SAT. I was a straight A student. I had X many majors in these challenging subjects, and I took these difficult courses. But after a few years, what will matter is what have you accomplished since then. So, I hope that this presentation will have convinced you that there really is opportunity that depends not on how you've performed in a predetermined structure or hierarchy, but rather on what you do with yourself from now on. And it does require a lot of hard work. It requires you to use your mind creatively. It requires you to look at the particular situation, because what I'm telling you right now has to be adjusted to the circumstances in which you find yourself. And it may be that the solution you come up with is something that I haven't envisioned, but it would be an unorthodox solution, and it would be also a practical solution that obtains for you a tolerable standard of living. The last thing that I will leave you with is simply a reminder that you should know what you're looking for. You should really examine what you value in life. And I'm not talking about value from the most fundamental perspective, the philosophical perspective of do you value life or do you value death? Do you value this reality or do you believe in some alternate reality that you consider to be higher and superior to that? I'm talking about a more concrete degree of valuation. What degree of material comfort do you want for yourself? What kind of place do you want to live in? Do you require a lot of space? Would you like to live in a house soon? Would you like to live in an area with a particular climate or with particular activities available nearby? What kinds of goods do you enjoy? How do you enjoy spending your leisure time? How much leisure time do you think that you require in order to lead a good life? And all of these questions you should seriously address because they form essential portions of your standard of living. Some people would not be satisfied with, for instance, earning $100,000 a year if they have to live in New York, where even the price of a small apartment is so expensive that in the evening, after they spend 12 hours a day working at the job that earns them $100,000 a year, they return to a shabby, old one-room apartment. Personally, I wouldn't be happy with that kind of life either. On the other hand, if they could find a job that pays $50,000 or $60,000 a year in an area where real estate prices are reasonable, they could get a decently sized house. So, in that case, the latter situation would be a higher standard of living. Don't look at absolute monetary figures. Don't look at money as a single measure of value. Just as, for students, don't look at grades as a single measure of value. At some points in my life, I made that mistake. Look at value from the standpoint of what would make your life the most desirable life it could be, the life you would be most fulfilled with. And that's a life that needs to have hard work, it needs to have continual self-development, and it needs to have, in many respects, a critical attitude toward what your possibilities are and what reality is. Not an attitude of wishful thinking, but an attitude sometimes of hard realism. But on the other hand, it shouldn't be an attitude of sacrifice. It shouldn't be an attitude where you lose yourself in the pursuit of money. You lose yourself in the pursuit of a career. You lose yourself in a pursuit of prestige. That would be terrible and an unconscionable waste. So I hope that you will be able to extract something of value from this advice and to apply it. And if you have any kinds of experiences that you would like to let me know about that would supplement what I've said here or would challenge it, please, I would be very intrigued. Thank you very much, and I hope you have a good day.